register borderline communities and Khoisan people. It is against this background that the department is overhauling its policy and legislative framework to ensure that we protect the identity and status of every person, irrespective of their race, sex, gender, etc. Progress in the development of policies is at advanced stage and will soon be translated to new legislation once approved by Cabinet. And the policies are, first one being official identity management policy. We're also working on the Green Paper on marriages in South Africa, as well as the Green Paper on citizenship, international migration, and refugee protection. At the center of these reforms is a commitment from a state to prohibit unfair discrimination, aimed to protect and regulate the interest of all who reside in South Africa in terms of their status, identity, and specific rights and powers. Section 9 of the Constitution prohibits direct or indirect discrimination on the grounds of gender, sexual orientation, or sex. Though there is still much to be done by the department to ensure that we are fully aligned with Section 9 of the Constitution, we are pleased to be here today as we have begun to take the steps to address some of these systematic discriminatory practices in our systems. Working with the LGBTIQ community, the department is making efforts to deal with transgender and intersex issues, as well as the alteration of sex description on the National Population Register, to ensure that records on the National Population Register are a true reflection of the sex and intersex clients. To ensure that our officials are fully capacitated, further training on LGBTQI issues has become the norm of our continuous training, including issues relating to gender-based violence. Though there is still much work to be done by the department to ensure that we are fully aligned with Section 9 of the Constitution, we are pleased again to be here today as we have begun to take the steps to address some of the systematic issues that have been picked in our system. President Nelson Mandela once said, open quote, "It looks impossible until it's done," close quote. We believe that
shall no longer refer to people as ladies and gentlemen, but would say gender non-conforming persons in platforms like these, for instance. And I think that's how we unlearn some of the patriarchal things that we've inherited in our society, is to, in platforms like this, insist on referring and generally insist on using terms like gender neutral and gender non-conforming persons. I think those are some of the things that...
For gender equality, dear members of the South African and European civil society, dear representatives of LGBTQIA+ communities, dear participants. I'd like to welcome all of you to this policy dialogue. First of all, I'm absolutely delighted that this dialogue has so much interest, especially at a very high level, with a number of deputy ministers and ministers, and finally kept the idea alive, and that's why we're here today. So I hope that this dialogue today actually underlines the fact that these discussions are crucial to advance the rights of trans and intersex. Mr. Jeffery, to translate these principles into reality for all people living in South Africa, for example, through the support that has been provided to the National LGBTI Task Team. The EU is one of the top development partners worldwide supporting LGBTIQA+ civil society organizations. Over the last years, we've provided numerous community in Europe, and we won't compromise on our principles and values. We believe in a Europe that embraces diversity and does not hide it. And this conviction and our commitment is also reflected in our actions globally and with our partners, including in South Africa. This dialogue is an excellent example of such collaboration, and we're very proud to support this dialogue.
Thank you, Crispin. Those were interesting days at university. DDG, my English came by boat, as you can tell. Indeed, something is only possible until it is impossible until it's done. And I think for us, we've been waiting 18 years since the inception of the Alteration of Sex Description and Sex Status Act to come to this particular moment and have a dialogue around what the future prospect for change of Africa, with conservative right-wing political parties receiving increased support. In essence, this phenomena is reflective of global political developments and suggests that these parties and leaders and their bases become even more active and appealing to voters in the coming years. This brings the prospect of an inclusive and legislation that enable us to amend our particulars on the basis of the right to gender self-determination. Thirdly, we also seek to address any issue that intersects with the right to legal gender rights and undo historical legacies of gender and social injustice. The fact that we are all sitting here today is testimony to a deep principled commitment that we share towards an ideal, towards a dream, towards a call to action for a more equitable on the basis of self-determination. While they fail to do so, they continue to enable much human rights abuses around the world. Everyone, the call to action is clear. To our lawmakers, law interpreters, the call to action is clear. The responsibility now rests upon
In society, we need to have a society that is gender inclusive, but mostly we need to ensure that we have gender justice. And this just reminds me of something that I heard quite recently at one of the conferences. I think someone was saying, government is about politics, but state today.
We look forward in our democracy that the elections were free and fair. People were able to express their views without any fear or favor. I see this dialogue also as a platform to share views on how to improve policies for transgender and intersex. In society, the struggles that Simon Colley spoke of were to be eradicated. Our forebears ushered us into a democratic state. At the core of that democratic state is a constitutional basis, which we find in the preamble. Despite these systematic inequalities and unfair discrimination remain deeply embedded in social structures, practices, and attitude, undermining the aspiration of our constitutional democracy. As we mark the 25th anniversary of our Constitution, it is appropriate that we recall and legal challenges. In my view, the position paper titled Keeping the Promise of Dignity and Freedom for All, Gender Dynamics and the Legal Resource Center for Citizens, and free the potential of each in a tangible way. If we are able to prioritize equality and dignity in total pursuit of fulfilling our constitutional democracy, we will not have another Jade September experience. I certainly think that the experience of Jade September
keynote address, and I think we should note your interesting recommendation there that at least we should ensure that departments in their annual performance plan actually show how many people they've trained for gender sensitivity. I think that is a notable recommendation, and I hope this conference would also see how we can make that something that becomes compulsory across government, whether local, provincial, or national, across the state as well, even perhaps in institutions like the judiciary and parliament. Having said that, Minister, thank you. And also currently working with IGLA, and they would be assisting us to move this discussion forward. But before that, I'd like the EU Commissioner, Ms. Dalli, who could not be able to join us today, to send us to give us her address via video in her role.
For this sector. During the same year, I had the great honor to listen to the personal stories of the participants of the Third International Intersex Forum that was taking place in Malta. Form of unconsented medical and surgical intervention on intersex infants and adolescents. The cry of marginalized communities in the streets is often nothing about.
It can never be partial. I think that's absolutely true. I'd like to step off the podium now and hand over to Patricia, who will moderate the next session, which is on international perspectives and human rights aspects, and she'll moderate it, I understand, virtually. Over to you, Patricia. Am I audible to you? Am I audible to you? Am I audible to you? Am I audible to you?
Okay, good morning.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Who was appointed, as you know, probably in December 2019 to be the European Commissioner for Equality. And in this role, she has a particular responsibility for strengthening commitment to equality and inclusion, anti-discrimination, the LGBTI strategy, a gender strategy, and addressing gender-based violence, supporting the EU's accession as well to the Istanbul Convention around gender-based violence, trying to address the issues and engaging in dialogue with the different stakeholders, providing advice and technical assistance, as well as capacity building. So Victor, I think it would be really interesting to hear what you kind of can say to the South African, both policymakers and civil society organizers as they are working forward to make more real and to implement the laws that already exist in South Africa. And then secondly, we also have Silvana Dias, who I know from before. So yes, thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good night to you today from Costa Rica. So wonderful to be able to join you through these means. As you know, the mandate of the independent expert was precisely created with the idea of, on one hand, providing visibility to the way in which violence and discrimination occurs in the everyday life of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and gender diverse persons, as well as in relation to the particular issue. When we are talking about issues such as violence and discrimination, of course, we may start the analysis in relation to specific issues of violence, which concern, for example, the gathering of data about the way persons are suffering attacks to their life, to their personal integrity, to their personal freedom. And then we can move on to analysis that is discrimination-based and that will lead us to sectoral analysis that will eventually lead us to understand, to the fact that there are very significant instances of violence recorded around the world and that it was necessary to acknowledge that that violence occurs as a result of real or perceived sexual orientation or gender identity. In this context, it's important that we recognize that what this mandate covers, and I believe that this is part of the genius of the way that it was, with the idea that the creation of the mandate constituted a political acknowledgement that sexual orientation and gender identity are necessary points of entry when it comes to the analysis of violence and discrimination within our societies, and that of all of these aspects. So There you have already what I conclude in the most preliminary ways in relation to how approaches are effective in being implemented. Intersectional analysis, the idea that we need to adopt public policy, legislation, and access to justice in the acknowledgement of the very nature sinful. Now, some of these drivers actually relate in a very main way to the duty of the state of providing enabling environments for the consecution of human rights. And therefore, criminalization in itself is not only a great obstacle to the fulfillment of rights, but also a driver of systematic discrimination and violence in very many other aspects around the world. Now, we know that South Africa, in the specific context that we have, has not a specific criminalization in relation to and necessitates the analysis of a holistic view of the legal system to make sure that those deep grooves carved by criminalization will have been completely eradicated from the legal system. And once you talk about that in relation to the legal system, you will start to also see the need to adopt enabling legislation. And of course, enabling legislation includes Now, again, this is a process that will take, in my view, several decades to be completed, because even when the elimination in the international classification of diseases has been ensured, and even where pathologization has been eliminated in the books, let's remember, in relation to, we'll proceed to wrap up very quickly this initial kind of set of thoughts. This particular relationship with the idea of pathologization impacts very clearly the existences of intersex persons. And it actually creates a legal, regulatory, and social environment where it is enabled and appears to be socially condoned. And of course, to that realm pertain all of the measures concerning the pervasiveness of hate speech, and of course, hate crimes, prejudice-motivated crimes all around societies. Patricia, this is the environment, the frame around in which to speak about the adoption of effective actions in this context. And I was truly delighted to hear of this initiative, which has in such a way created a bridge between South Africa and Malta, and with a number of stakeholders that I've been constantly in touch with, and that I know are also very supportive of the work of the mandate. So
intersex and trans people. So is there anything in particular that you think that the EU's LGBTI strategy can be used for, or broadly? We have a little technical problem. We're not hearing Sylvain. Okay. And there he's there with us. Okay. Okay, this is what we try to do. This is what happens when we're trying to bring about 6 different continents together. Countries. Can you hear me, Sylvain?
Thank you, Patricia, and good morning to all the participants. Can you not hear me? I mean, we have the male and female boxes in which everybody in society has to fit in. And this is how we went about it. Women have suffered greatly, gendered also because of this. And so we asked them to fit in through medicalization and various procedures that we build not come automatically for trans persons. And there is this overemphasis of raising this, because I think that this is that we will be having society where men had particular roles that could not be breached. Only restricted for same-gender couples could not accede to marriages to address those discriminations, to be themselves fully. It happen for trans and intersex persons. And you hear me now? I don't see myself anymore. You hear me, right? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So a human rights approach needs to look at the person and not at society. Now, from the moment the Argentinians adopted their gender identity strategy to all this, the EU LGBTIQ equality strategy tries to bring this into the way it's framed. So you will go through the strategy and not find too many trans and intersex specific measures, for the simple reason that trans and intersex are literally visible throughout the whole text, and we wanted to make this so. The text is also intersectional, precisely because we have multiple identities, but nonetheless, specifically, we're looking at the provision of guidance to member states and businesses on enhanced trans and intersex persons' participation in the labor market. We're also carrying out a study on the socioeconomics of the barriers faced by intersex persons in different areas of life, including employment, health, and education. We're conducting research on trans and intersex communities and their access to healthcare in the EU. And then we're supporting legal gender recognition legislation and procedural changes in the member states that request this, as well as providing space for sharing of knowledge and experiences. Beside all this, inside the European Commission, we're conducting a process of change. So that is also in terms of the way we communicate externally, communicate internally, the way our forms are formulated. When we mention trans and intersex, we also need to take care of non-binary persons. And so we need to change not only our forms, but the way we present information. We often have images, for example, supporting our work and our publicity campaigns. Those too will include trans and intersex persons. So there's a lot of this that is going on.
I'm not sure whether Sylvain has finished or whether I'm cutting across him now. The sound has...
No, I have.
Okay, thanks, Sylvain. Thanks for letting me know. That's really interesting that you're also working, if you like, on the internal work of the Commission as well as externally. And there was a question from the floor there, and just to be sure to pick it up fully, oh dear. Okay, there seems to be some kind of a problem there. Again, I don't know whether it's me or whether it's Sylvain. But maybe, Victor, maybe I could ask you a question while we try to see to get Sylvain back again. There's 2 years left in your mandate. What do you hope for South Africa in that time? And how can you work with South Africa in fast-tracking the creation of new laws and policies? So you were talking about already having visited South Africa a lot and encouraging this event. But is there anything in particular that you, in your role with the mandate, can do to support the work in the next 2 years?
Thank you, Patricia. I trust that you can hear me well. For some reason, I cannot I'm not enabled to start my video, but I trust that you can hear me well.
We can indeed.
So I think that the fundamental lines of work that the mandate has identified for global action also have, we are as clear of the manner in which these processes affect the everyday life of persons. And I think that in that, I will connect with one of the main challenges that is felt across the globe, and that it's, I know, also a challenge in South Africa, which is how to ensure that the lived realities of LGBT and intersex persons and gender diverse persons be accurately reflected in data collection and data management, and in good practices of data collection and management. And if I may, this is an area where the European Union has great technical advice to provide, because in my view, after my assessment on my report on data, the European Union has made great strides in creating good practice in relation to data collection and management. And again, I mean, part of that is also ensuring that the particular realities of intersex persons be accurately reflected in the way that the legal framework is responding to these issues. I also mentioned, Patricia, the issue of conversion therapy or conversion efforts, one that I think necessitates undoubtedly in global, regional, and local, including, of course, South Africa, contexts, decided action to ensure that we see a world free of this scourge. And then I can just leave you with the what will become the priorities of the mandate over the next 2 years, in which I would very much hope for the active participation of South African civil society and the South African state, just like I've had the privilege to have during the first 4 years of my mandate. And that is going to be inquiries, research inquiries, in relation to the issues of health and Sustainable Development Goal 3, and the manner in which a case study can be built for a connectivity between human rights-based approaches and development approaches. Again, something in which there, Patricia, to be quite frank, I think that there's a lot to be learned from South Africa as well in relation to the work of making this connection and making political realities of agendas of inclusion. So I think that there's a great agenda for exchange and dialogue in relation to that issue. I count on the fact that I work very closely with my dear colleague, Dr. Tlaleng, the Special Rapporteur on Right to Health, and that we have forged a substantive alliance in relation to these issues. And of course, she's a great gift of South Africa to the world, if I may say. I think this will be part of what I'm hoping to work with. And 3 other keywords.
Actually, Victor, can I interrupt you, because we have got Sylvain back, and I suppose I just want to make sure that we get to see.
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you, Victor. Sylvain, thanks for coming back to us. I'm sorry about these technical difficulties. The question that I was putting to you at the time was just commenting on what you mentioned in relation to doing the internal work with the Commission, which I think is great, because sometimes it's the institution that is trying to make other people change that doesn't necessarily change itself. So I think that's really interesting that you're bringing around changes internally to the Commission. But then I was wanting to ask in particular around what the EU can do in terms of its external relations portfolios of work, if you like, joining that with the LGBTI strategy and how it can work specifically with the South African government around this, and if there's anything you could add on that.
There's plenty that can be done.
Good.
First, yes, the LGBTIQ equality strategy is not inward looking in the EU only, but it has a whole chapter for international participation and the progression of LGBTIQ equality around the world. So we want to progress this file. We want to work with South Africa. We want to work with all countries really that are open to progressing equality. This event is also happening in participation, also through financial assistance from the European Union. So we're serious about this, both in terms of technical support and other forms of support. Systematically around the world, around Idaho and so on, we raise the flag. But that's only a symbol. When it comes to the specifics, we can discuss. Actually, trans and intersex people, I think, are the sort of group that no institution can adequately address if it doesn't address itself first, because so much has to do with forms, with recognition of name, gender, changes, systematizing those changes. Sometimes, not sometimes, several trans persons, and I would presume also intersex persons, encounter difficulties because the old name keeps coming up, for example, right? Mm-hmm. So in order to address things like that, you need to have information technology that is, if you will, erasing such a past, or at least putting it aside entirely, and creating the new space for the present. Something like that we can share, of course. These are the sort of things we are doing ourselves. In many ways, the European Commission is also in the same journey as South Africa right now. Because the LGBTIQ quality strategy is the first one of its kind. We never had a similar document. And because it is so comprehensive, and because now we have the tools, we have, for example, what we call Task Force on Equality. And this is, I think, revolutionary, and I don't use that word lightly. What this means is we have in the Office of the Secretary General of the European Commission now a unit dedicated to mainstreaming equality across all of the organization. Equality is no longer coming from DG Justice as the sole Directorate General in the Commission that was pushing for equality. Now, all the Gs, whether it's transport, climate change, you name it, everybody has to push for equality. And actually, it's expected. Institutionally, it's expected from everybody. What that means also is that you won't get male, female, other on the form only when you participate to equality events, but you will have that at the environmental conference, at the poverty conference, at the, post-pandemic conference, you name it, right? So anything dealing with us now is, and all our products and tools will be transformed in this way. I think that is something that we can definitely share. We can also link South Africa, although clearly they're good at linking themselves to member states within the EU. Maybe they don't need us, but maybe they will want some technical, knowledge that maybe they don't have access to. We can create a space. I know that the delegation to South Africa of the European Union is very keen on continuing to fostering this relationship, and they will do their utmost to serve.
Great. Thank you very much, Sylvain. And I guess then that leaves it over to everybody who's in the room there in Pretoria to actually take all of those opportunities up and to explore them a little bit further. I'm just conscious of time, and we only have 5 minutes left. And I wanted to ask both of you, maybe for your final thoughts on that in the next couple of days, the focus is going to be on intersex rights. And I'm just wondering if there's any particular guidance that you would offer, either from international practice, and I'm focusing, I suppose, as well, and kind of looking at within Africa that there is good practice in Kenya. So I'm wondering if there's anything internationally or that you would suggest, Victor, in terms of the mandate. And also, Sylvain, then, because you were involved in the work in terms of in Malta creating that legislation, is there anything particular around the legislation or the policies or following through on the lived lives that you would like to draw the attention of the participants to? So Victor, maybe we'd start with you.
Thank you, Patricia. Very quickly, along with my thanks, I would just share what the purpose and the way of acting about this has been in relation to the mandate since the very early start as a result of my conversations with particularly intersex activists. I think the human rights concerns of intersex persons must be recognized as quintessentially an interdisciplinary concern. That means that I have resisted any attempt of automatically conflating or adding the I to LGBT as an exercise of automatic inclusion without reflecting carefully what are the specific issues that impact on intersex persons, and rather I have attempted to work within frameworks that recognize that my mandate, but also the mandate on health, the mandate on freedom from torture, the mandate on truth because of access to medical records, rights of children, and other mandates actually have in what is a holistic human rights perspective of the concerns of intersex persons. And I do believe that creating that specialized framework will very, very clearly delineate the points in which violations occur against intersex persons based on preconceptions about how gender relates to, for example, the appearance of genitalia. But I think that it is important to recognize that this is inscribed into a context, that has specificity and that has a texture and a nuance that must be acknowledged each and every case. Thank you very much, Patricia.
Thank you, Victor. And Sylvain, the last word to you. Any particular advice around intersex work that the South African team here can progress?
Well, my best advice can only be listen to the activists. This sector would not be where it is if you weren't listening to what the activists are telling us, what the intersex persons themselves who experienced the medicalization, the invasive treatment that they never asked for. You know, if we don't listen to them, we will always get it wrong. So what is great about this conference is that I went through, of course, the list of speakers, and I see that several good speakers are here, several important you yourself, Patricia, were there on day one when the International Intersex Forum was being launched, and you helped foster the dialogue and exchange that was needed at that given moment. Look at where we are now, and we can go a lot further if we listen to the people and to the activists. Beyond that, I mean, there are increasingly great texts out there, great international human rights texts from the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe to pretty much all international institutions today dealing with human rights. They all have good texts. Scrutinize those and extract from them what is of value to South Africa. But I insist, speak to the activists, learn from the activists, and address what the activists tell you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Sylvain. And thank you, Victor, for staying up so late. I gather it's 2:30 or 2 o'clock in the morning with you. So thank you very much for being with us at that ungodly hour of the day. And Sylvain, safe traveling onto your next meeting. Thank you again. And enjoy your cup of tea now that I think you're all probably well deserved. Take care. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you very much to Patricia and the team. I think that the insights were quite insightful. So indeed, we are now going to break for tea. And the tea is from 10:50 to 11:15. Let's try, please, stick to the time constraints that we have. So I'll start badgering you at around 11:13 to ensure that we come back and start exactly at 11:15 for the next session. Without further ado, then let's take our tea break. To those online, I guess then you can do whatever you'd like to do. so far we've been doing well on time, and I'd like us to just maintain that momentum. Yes, you can give everyone a round of applause for maintaining time. It's just working out the thing that's a bit older than me. For the past 2 decades, in advocacy and legal gender recognition, gender-affirming healthcare, and SOGI human rights. Estienne will introduce the next 2 speakers. I'd like to hand over to Estienne. Estienne, you have the floor.
Is joining us online, so.
I'm here, Estienne. I'm available.
Oh, are you there? Sorry, I can't. It's not
I'm here,
project.
thank you.
Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
the video, yes, of course.
Thanks, Gerard. Unfortunately, I can't see you where I'm sitting. So yes, thanks. Thank you. I think it's a great and momentous opportunity to be here. I think as someone who's been involved, as Crispin has said, for more than 2 decades, line the current context of legal gender recognition in South Africa from both health and legal and policy perspectives. So we have 2 panelists here from the health and home affairs policy sectors respectively. And I think as many of us know, and there will still be a lot of discussion around this today, there is an interplay between medical pathologization, both medical and psychosocial pathologization of trans and intersex persons, binary, the enforcement of binary concepts of gender, and legal recognition of gender identity in South Africa. So our 2 panelists will outline some of the issues, problems, barriers, and challenges involved in how our current gender recognition law, which is the professor at the University of Pretoria, is also a past president of the South African Society of Psychiatrists, and a current member of the Health Committee of the Health Professions Council of South Africa. He's a psychiatrist working mainly with adults with more than 20 years of experience, including for the past 8 years a special interest in transgender care. He's also involved in research on the interplay between mental health care, human rights, and autonomy. His pronouns, as you would have deduced, is he, him. And then next to me, 9 for short, is what we call our gender recognition law. He will also touch on planned reforms in South Africa's marriage regime, as some of these reforms also deal with challenges currently faced by trans persons. So I think without further ado, Professor Gerard Grobler, I hand over to you to speak from a health perspective and your experience with transgender clients and gender affirming healthcare and how this may intersect with their access to IDs and gender markers. Thank you. Yeah, should we? Okay, I think while we're waiting for Gerard to connect, I don't know, Mr. Sikhle, would you be willing to start us off with the Home Affairs policy right. Perspective? Thank you.
Hello. Hello.
Oh, just a moment. Gerard, are you with us?
Care and providing care as best as we can. My view on the situation is that according to Act 49, to listen to the other views, and then
you have in some way altered your sex character at least 2 years in the gender role under the gender in which they want to be registered.
All right. No, thank you very much. So you will have seen the committee. We call it official identity management policy. It goes right into the issues that have already been raised right now. The second policy, that would be 12, and then if the date of birth was the 6th, it would be 06. That is how your ID number is constructed. Then the 7th number, if male or in terms of your age. The second option was to keep the current binary ID number, which was clearly unfair, unconstitutional. Public consultations, and also we had a dialogue with the LGBTQ+ community. The community then advised us, said, it's fine, you can have that gender neutral kind of an ID, because the way the ID is constructed right now, we need to know who is a citizen and who is not a citizen. They're very clear on that one. You then need to check, if you make those changes at a policy level, what are the social implications, what are the economic implications, and many other implications that you look at. Then we ended up, we could have just went straight to a gender, immediately mean you belong to a particular community. So that is, I think, the fundamental shift that we have made, and it's that trauma. So that's the first, I think, fundamental change that we are making. Going forward, what we are proposing, there are two principal acts that deal with identity in South Africa. The first one is the Identification Act 68 of 1997. The debate here should not be about Act 49 going forward. It's only Act 49 because it's what you are confronting issues of marriage. When it comes to issues of marriage for transgender couples, because there is a link with your ID, your sex, your gender, with other status, not binary, male or female. It's you are either a female or a male in that legislation. The second legislation is the Civil Union Act. That act is to a large extent what will fall under a gender neutral marriage legislation, because it doesn't, it's really the directive from the court was, no, you must keep this couple married. So in future, so the court said you must find a transitional mechanism.
And maybe just one immediate question that came up is around the gender neutral ID and what would happen at birth when a child is born.
Hi, thank you so much. I think my question is related to the integration and linkages with these changes across departments. For example, how this could strengthen gender affirming care and access to gender affirming care and health care. When one then wants to change one's marker, is it the Malta model where one just has an affidavit which says this is who I am and therefore I'm changing my documentation and so forth? And yeah, and I guess how does that intersect then with strengthening other intersectional accesses such as healthcare? Thanks.
I think COKT's
papers. When somebody tells me that it's 6 months and that 6 months is short, what happens to my life expectancy? What happens to my life and its dignity? So who do we then hold to account? Because if parties that have been put into positions of power are the very same parties that tells us that 6 months is quite short to have your identity documentation be processed in record time, then what does that mean? Who do I then go to? Who do I then consult if the very same stakeholders that have been put into positions of power are the very same ones to tell us that 6 months is quite a short time? I'm actually very tired.
Firstly, if what we are proposing is addressing fundamental challenges to the community. All right. So I think the next step now, I think I was speaking with another colleague earlier on from the community, say it's well and good to change the policy, to change the legislation, but the bigger end here and be proud about stories that we hear from this community. So there are things that, as a state, and I'm speaking here on behalf of the department, things that we've got to change even before we change the policy and the legislation. I think some of those things deal with amendments. The next speaker from Home Affairs, this one is a real doctor. Doctor advocacy around what is being proposed here. Because you can change the policy, you can change the legislation, but if other elements of the state do not understand what are the issues that you are trying to address here, we will be, I don't want to say we'll be wasting our time, but we won't be addressing challenges that that will face when the policy has been changed, the legislation has been changed, and people see you with a non-binary ID level. In terms of the details behind that, there's further work that needs to be done, and when we deal with the legislation, I think those details will be covered. It's quite recent. We received close to 1,000 submissions. For identity policy, I think it was, I can't remember, let me not, was it 400? We received
legislative environment. And I, for one, am very happy to support that, because I think that will take away part of the burden. How that would affect healthcare and access to healthcare, I think it requires a broader discussion, but I think it's going to take away some of the stigmatization and the difficulty that the community experiences in accessing the legal gender.
Going forward, which would include dealing with amendments to ID numbers, because gender will still be recorded in the ID numbers. So those problems are still on the table. And I think another issue is then, or I've just been thinking,
a mixed, a hybrid approach is because of the existing IDs which people are sitting with, and to change that,
Thank you, goodbye.
It's going to be chaired by a dynamic person. I'd like to call Jabu to come up front to come and introduce the next panel members. But I'd also just, I think if Dr. Aaron can just also up. Gabriela Kajela, head of SOGI unit from Malta, and Sanya Borman. Jabu and the team, you the guys before lunch, and I think people are a bit hungry, so.
Okay, great. I think my rights and all the intersections, so really happy to have you here. In person as well, and also a friend I've come to meet and know, and within the Human Rights Directorate in the Ministry of Equality, Government of Malta. And in fact, a lot of the modeling of Gabriela's unit is something that we've been trying to advocate and look for in relation to could we have a central place within our own government looking at these issues and its cross-sectoral issues, instead of the various fragmentations around the national, to where you got now. And maybe if you could just give us some insights into that. Welcome.
Yes, well, good morning, everyone. Sorry, I'm a bit hoarse, so I hope you can understand me, and that you are hearing me well. So just to give a bit of background, 1995. So this is where the court proactively ordered an annotation to be made in the trans woman's act of birth to reflect her affirmed gender, and the annotation contained a reference to the court judgment and to the fact that this person had undergone individuals themselves. There was also a limitation in that those who were applying for legal gender recognition under these provisions could not be married. At that time in Malta, Malta did not even have divorce yet. Divorce in Malta was introduced in 2011. So this basically resulted in an impossibility for married trans persons to access legal gender recognition. And as well, over time, there seem to be inconsistencies in terms of the applicability of this legal gender recognition, since say the provisions, the principles that were adopted in this legislation, I would say they were respectful of human rights. That was the priority. So, for example, they did away with any kind of waiting period in order to access legal gender recognition. There was no real-life experience test. There were no gatekeepers. So, in essence, people were who they said they were. There was also a process of depathologization. So, in a sense that trans people were not considered to, and also any binary endorsement, in the sense that persons did not need to prove that they were feminine or masculine enough, right? So, again, people were who they said they were. We also provided access to legal gender recognition to children, and of course,
we are gathered like this today, and taken from the Deputy Minister, John Jeffery. The indication was that there is, with regards to the right, but in some legislation, the Act would then say this is what should happen, but they regulate transgender persons in a manner that it's perceived to be, or in a manner that is not discriminatory, in a manner that is fair, so much so that as Home Affairs, in our practice, in our everyday life of going about serving our persons or our people, we serve in a...
And good morning to everyone. It's not morning anymore, 12:30. So very simply for me, when I think about a human rights-based approach to legal gender recognition, what it's really about is substantive equality, which is equality in outcomes. And that is what our Constitution actually requires. And of course, human dignity, which is very closely related. They are inseparable. And the reality is that in the absence of legal gender recognition, all the other rights that we have in South Africa are to children in Section 28. So this, for example, played out in the story of a young transgender girl who I will call T some years ago. T had been in the childcare system since about the age of 12. Her mom didn't know how to cope with her gender identity and basically gave her to the state to raise and educate. And T found herself in a system that really, the story of how the process concluded in basically a compromise law that really missed the lived reality, the practical lived reality of transgender people in South Africa. And so that's the process was problematic, but the substance also remains problematic. And I don't need to tell you much about that. Conference organizers have provided us with this lovely document. And that's what makes this conference so hopeful and such an encouraging event, is that we can come together to talk. Yes, we're going to talk, but more importantly, we're also going to listen. Because we didn't listen in 2003 when transgender people said they wanted gender of transgender people and gender non-conforming people can't be allowed to fall into a hole of we don't know what to do with you. There has to be clarity in all state institutions around the issue, because in 2021, really, transgender people can't be subject to the arbitrary personal understanding or prejudices of individual state officials, which can and will training. I think that's critically important. And there also has to be consequences for those who choose to ignore the laws and the policies that we are at pains to make in this process. There was no point, for example, for a client I'll call BT, who is a young transgender woman, when there are standard operating procedures on the detention of transgender prisoners.
Are affirming the status quo, and you're saying this unfortunately is the law, and this is absolutely then what we have to do. Does that not kind of read as an anti-rights approach? So if the evidence is against the practice, why must the practice continue as is? So if the issue is about, say, a black market of hormones, a black market of various aspects, and it's a vicious cycle of so many other things that are further. We support the future. How do we remedy the present?
Thank you. Are not enough or to equal the rights as presented in various legislative prescripts. The Deputy Minister indicated that some of these things are not necessary. Working together with justice and satisfactory. That's my take. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Gabriella, from your perspective?
Well-being clinic, we are building the capacity of the healthcare sector in general to provide inclusive healthcare services. So all of this, right, is part of the process, which also takes a little bit of time. But what is important is that the law...
Warning from someone who's waited for heaven knows how long to have their document changed. Can you fix the situation with standard operating procedures if those SOPs are based on something that is broken? And I think you perhaps can, and I've looked at you, and March 2023.
I'm going to open the floor to questions and to those online. I have one comment, question from a pair. Who's behind John? Anastasia, please. Can you go in that order? There's mics on this side and that side. B, you can go. Yeah, please. Yeah, there's a mic on the left and on the right-hand side.
Hi. I think one of the things that's been really important for us as civil society has been the
sense from the department. What's the stance on that at the moment? If you are a transgender prisoner and you want to elect to change your gender marker, is that facility available? And that perhaps can become a consideration in strengthening the SOPs that we are busy working with as part of a transitionary arrangement, taking us to the fully fledged law reform process. So just to get a sense around that.
Discretion on the side of the police and the law enforcement on whether to actually go ahead and arrest sex workers for doing sex work. In the same way, you know, if we know those are actually human rights violations, we're moving to the decriminalization of sex work, there is that commitment, then stop that.
Thanks. Good afternoon. And I'd like to commend our colleagues from the various departments for their attendance here. I think my question here is, how do we build in continuity and accountability? And I think what's come out of this discussion and this wonderful panel is that there are whatever decisions are made, especially if the policy is predominantly written by people who don't have the lived experience, there will be deficits. We will become aware of them down the line. Act 49 was compromised, yes, but it was celebrated. We look back on it now, it is deprecated. And I promise you the legislation that we...
In relation to gender marker changes and the rights of prisoners.
Yes, yeah. So to start with that, the way we facilitated that process was to draw up a policy That's of the ways that we worked in this sector.
Thank you.
It was a struggle, I have to say, okay, but we got there.
You want to add anything else, Gabriela? I missed that.
Well, I would say just perhaps since if I had to conclude, I would say looking at our experience,
it's an inalienable entitlement of all people at all times and in all places, whether or not they are citizens or migrants, no matter their sex, their class, their age, or their sexual orientation. I think that should be the fundamental basis. You indicated how then do you fix? There should be a way through which we are able to deal with such persons or provide service to such persons. Fortunately, under the current regime, I guess if I'm not wrong, the minister is taking care of both the justice element and also correctional services. So we've got two. How do you...
does recognize the evolving capacity of children to consent to things that concern them, different kinds of health interventions and so on. So I don't see a reason why the same couldn't apply. Couldn't apply here. And I'll close with a cautionary tale about SOPs. This time, not the Department of Home Affairs. You're off the hook now for the moment. Now we're talking about the Department of Correctional Services. After the judgment came out in the September case, of course, the department might have felt the impetus to actually make standard operating procedures or some sort of a policy. The sad thing is they did this without speaking to any of us. And so now we have SOPs, or what purport to be SOPs, but no one knew about it and no one was consulted, and as a result, the content is not really hitting the target. And so all of that work was done and will probably have to be redone. And that is what happens when you don't collaborate with the affected people.
Yeah.
And those are my thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you everybody for being part of the session. Gabriela, thank you so much.
So we have the vegan, vegetarian food that will be served underneath the tent. And then there'll be 2 sets of buffets inside the restaurant. And let's spread ourselves out to ensure that we have shorter queues, because we wouldn't want a situation where we are queuing too long to eat. And let's try to return back here by 14:20 in preparation for the next session. mic'd up, please? Grace? You get mic'd up? Oh, okay. Okay, guys, rather everyone, if our next set of panelists can get mic'd up, please, so that we can get the conversation moving. Just a reminder of our social media hashtags for those of us who are on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. SA_EU talk, trans intersex rights, transgender rights, hashtag intersex rights, and hashtag end IGM. I think it's quite important that we do try and incorporate these hashtags in our social media conversations so that this discussion can really be beyond this room, and other people who may not have been able to make this discussion are able to interact with the discussion in at least the form of social media. I've seen some good tweets from Iranti and Gender Dynamics. Thanks, guys. Please keep it up. The hashtags actually are right on the wall. So I see the Deputy Minister also wants to. Oh, the Wi-Fi code is... SA_talks. SA_EU talks. Okay, so the next discussion and the next panel has changed just a little bit. We've now actually realized that the Department of Home Affairs has actually done a bit of homework, and it's quite impressive. So I'm told by the experts. And so we actually want to take that conversation a bit further. So you would recall, as we had said in the first panel discussion, that listening to our colleagues in Home Affairs, we've now realized that there are actually some policy positions that they have taken. But it's one thing to take a policy position. Now the question is, how do we go about implementing those policy positions? And we're actually going to have a conversation about that up next. So if you look at your program, there will be some slight changes to it, but it's occasioned by us being responsive and us actually listening carefully to what is being presented and us giving effect to it. So as our panelists get mic'd up, I will still introduce the moderator for the next panel. You would have heard in the minister's speech, Minister actually commended the policy paper in preparation for this conference. And one of the authors for that paper is one of the moderators for the next session. That's Dr. B. Kaminga, and he's co-authored, like I've said, the policy position. I apologize there. Dr. Kaminga is a postdoctoral fellow at the African Center for Migration and Society at the University of the Witwatersrand. Their work considers the interrelationship between conceptual journey of the term transgender and the physical embodied journey of the transgender asylum seekers from the African continent. They will be joined by Mr. Sihle Mtimunye from Home Affairs, and Simtinyani, I apologize, After Lunch Gremlins, and Liberty Matesa from Gender Dynamics. Over to you, Dr. B.
Great, Chair. I'm waiting for you. Yeah. I think we're just waiting for everyone to be mic'd up. Okay, thanks to everyone for coming back from lunch. Over lunch, we had a discussion, and based on the number of questions we received and the interest in the policy paper and how we've moved forward from that moment, clearly, we thought it would be best to have a kind of longer engagement around where the proposed policy is going and what are the things that have been incorporated and where are some of the areas that we still have questions. And we understand the department to be open to a kind of dialogue and wanting to learn as well. And we thought this would be a great way to kind of facilitate, have a time to facilitate that kind of conversation and see where the direction of this policy is heading, and some of the things that the department is now thinking of in terms of what it's including in that policy and how those might work for some of us on the ground and having to live the daily realities of a lack of documents, a lack of access, et cetera, et cetera. Liberty?
No, certainly. I think that there were many considerations and concerns that we arrived with, and I'm very thankful and glad that you have addressed so many of them from both the conceptual foundation of the piece of legislation that is proposed, or the policy that is proposed, and then of course how it applies to different marginalized communities. And on that note, I think that there are some further clarities that we just seek around how the proposed steps that the department seeks to endeavor on is going to be impacting positively and for the benefit of these marginalized communities, and specifically, again, speaking to the rights of refugees and asylum seekers as well as children. Earlier on, we had a conversation about children's rights and how contentious that is to some degree, and particularly within the context of sexuality and gender discourse. In navigating that domain at this time, how do you foresee, for example, the lowering of the age of consent as an interim measure to be able to accommodate the needs of trans and gender diverse persons in context of them not necessarily being able to get parental consent or the consent of their guardians to be able to change the gender markers under the current piece of legislation? So I think that is just one question to start the process.
Easy. We're starting with the easy one.
All right. No, thank you very much. Am I audible? All right. So, Mr. Perry, you have noticed that I'm very particular with the issues of identity. So as soon as you called me Mr. Mtimunye, I responded. Because I am not Mr. Mtimunye, I'm Mr. Mtiani, but you corrected that. Then it dawned on me that how the conversation that we are having here is exactly about that, being caught by what you are not. So it's something that we don't take it light. And then let me start with a very first issue that you've raised around asylum seekers and refugees. So in terms of our, before we get to the issues of identity, in terms of the right of asylum seekers and refugees, maybe let's just start there. In terms of the Refugees Act of 1998, our Act does provide for people who are running from persecutions on the grounds of gender and sex. So the legal framework there is quite sound. Where we have challenges, I think it's what has been raised earlier on, is in terms of when you deal with status determination. The understanding that our colleagues have when it comes to that, it's something that we need to do more work on, because we have been approached in the past to look at that. And our response was clear, was the mischief is not on the legislation, but it's on the ground. People who are dealing with the status determination. So that is covered in terms of protecting those kinds of rights in terms of our legislation. In terms of identity, remember when you are dealing with the policy in South Africa, you starting from the premise, the preamble of the Constitution, where it's speaking about everyone. And there is no way when you're talking about everyone, you will then exclude the issues of identity. I think when Dirije was speaking in the morning, he said, we have made great strides towards ensuring that everyone is documented. Or the language that he used, that no one is left without the legal record of existence, that line. So we have made great strides on that, but we do recognize that in terms of the population register requirements, or the National Population Register, which is the system where we record all vital events of citizens, permanent residents, to a large extent refugees. But other categories are not recorded on our National Population Register. So what the official identity policy is then doing, it's saying people who are residing in South Africa are not only your citizens, your permanent residents, or just refugees. there are other people who are in South Africa who also go through these vital events which we capture under civil registration, which is birth, marriage, and death. So what we're going to do then in future, the population register. Obviously, in the population register, we will have different categories. But you'll be able to know who was born in South Africa. And when this person was born, was this person an asylum seeker, a refugee, or a visitor, or a child of a citizen? We will be having that documented and kept on our system. And we'll further support that with capturing of biometrics of everyone. So you see, if we are able to get biometrics of everyone on the system, in future, you will be able to move towards what we call digital identity, where eventually you don't even need your card. In fact, I was warning some colleagues who are in business of photocopying and printing documents that are saying your job is in danger. Because future does not have, you see what we're fighting about here. In fact, future doesn't have the ID card. Future doesn't have your passport. We're going e-passport, e-identity, which means whoever is in business of printing, it's a forewarning, but people don't listen when you warn them. So make sure that you find another business. So, yes.
Printed books made a comeback, though. People are reading the printed paper.
Sorry about that, so just on a lighter note. But the future basically is like that, it's a fact. So when it comes to asylum seekers and refugees, their details will be on the system. And they will be treated similar as you treat South Africans. There won't be any difference. And what we've realized also is there is no new right that you grant to a person by documenting that person properly. Because most of the rights are already provided for in the Constitution, whether you issue a document or you don't issue a document. So every child that is born in South Africa, irrespective of race, gender, sex, whatever categories that human beings want to put, that child will be documented on our system and will be issued with an appropriate document that is in line with what the Constitution is saying to us as a state and is able to enable that person to function in the community.
Okay.
In terms of children's rights, see, when we were not given something to prepare, you speak a lot.
Yeah.
Children's rights, basically, what we're saying there, we can't do much outside of the Children's Act. That is the foundational legislation. Currently, we are even changing the marriage regime to say the provision that allow children who are younger than 18 years to get married, those provisions should be removed. For the civil union, they are already removed. But the 1961 Marriage Act, they are still there. The 1998 customary recognition,
Recognition of Customary Marriages Act.
You can tell I'm not a polygamist. So we are aligning to the Children's Act as well as different protocols and international conventions that we have signed, like the SADC protocol, I think, on development and gender. It requires that the age should be 18 years for children to get married. So in terms of now changing the consent, here we will then be guided by the Department of Social Development. Obviously, the good thing is DM is here. From that angle, he can then bring us together to see how we navigate that space. I, however, do foresee that this, what you're asking for, may not be required in future. If we are saying in future ID numbers will be gender neutral. basically. So what you're asking for may really fall off. But yeah, that's my take on that one. Yeah.
Can I just ask perhaps a follow-up question, around the changes that need to be brought about under the Children's Act, and of course DSD being involved. To what extent do you see your role at the moment extending as an ally, as a supporter, to be able to engage the department as well in coming to the table around talking about the issue of age of consent? And we know, for example, that the age of consent has been lowered for specific medical practices or treatment, one being access to HIV services, the other one being termination of pregnancy for minors who can consent without parental authority being exerted. So to what extent do you foresee you being able to engage as the department with DSD in coming to the table? Because as civil society, we're very precariously placed in this particular matter, not necessarily having the power and the leverage to be able to bring different departments together in order to make change happen.
So again, my response here, in terms of age of majority, that responsibility does not sit with Home Affairs. There's a government department that has got that responsibility. Where we can come in as Home Affairs is where it affects the mandate of Home Affairs. In two areas we have spoken about the issues of age of majority. For marriage, as I'm saying, we're saying it's 18 years. Okay. The age at which a person can get an identity card, we have lowered that. It still needs to be approved by cabinet, but we have lowered that to 10 years.
Okay.
So that you'll be able to get your ID card as early as possible. But the overall policy framework for age of majority does not sit with Home Affairs. You would remember that different departments, even the police, have got their own issues around the age of at which the person can consent. Health is the same thing. But as far as Home Affairs is concerned, the changes that we are making are more about protecting the child more than anyone else.
I just want to pick up on a conversation that we were having over lunch about the ways in which this new identity management policy might translate, for instance, onto passports. You mentioned Canada recently implementing X passports. Is that something, I mean, for some of us who will have to access gender neutral ID numbers, for those of us who choose to, does that mean that there is a willingness to then also begin a process of translating that onto passports? Because there seems to be a misalignment then if I have a gender neutral number, but my passport still has to say M or F.
Okay. All right, maybe before even you get to the passports, now what this community has raised also very clearly was the issue of saying the Green ID book does not have letter M or F, while the Smart ID card has. So there's really no reason why we should not be able to revert to the old system. Because I remember in one engagement, the point that was raised was one of the reasons why there's not so much uptake for the Smart ID card from this community is because when you then change to the ID card, then you are now identified whether male or female. So that is another change, reform that we are going to bring on board as we deal with this policy change. In terms of the passports, the ICAO, I can't now remember what are the full names.
International Civil Aviation.
Yes, that's authority. We will have to align ourselves with that. But as you know, now there's international best practice. A few countries, I think recently Canada, has adopted gender neutral passport is something that we'll need to take into consideration. But what you then have is you have 3 options. I think they put an X on the third option. There's a lot of work that our principals at in different international platforms will need to do in terms of canvassing various opinions. But I don't think as a state we stand to lose anything by going that route. There was a time in our history where issues of race, which race you come from, which geographical area you come from, where they were used and they were put on our identity documents. Over time, those have fallen off. If there is no longer a rationale for keeping gender markers on our documents, why do we keep them? It's a different story when you're talking about keeping details on the system, and that will be for other reasons other than you being identified on a daily basis.
Great, thank you.
So just one of the things, Jeffery, I just want to come back to the issue of implementation as it stands now under Act 49. And of course, we've spoken about the SOPs that's now being strengthened. And yeah, it's a very interesting process that we're finding ourselves in. Perhaps on a personal note, and I was talking to some of my colleagues during lunch around the fact that we have been waiting quite long for our gender marker changes to be affected by the Department of Home Affairs. I myself have been waiting for 18 months, and I did an application last year in January, and so I haven't received concrete feedback after numerous follow-ups. And the questions stand around, there is this future-oriented way around looking at policy development in this regard, and then implementation still remains an issue. What makes you, on the one end, confident possibly that a system like this could succeed and that there will be follow-through by government, based on the fact that the current system, broken as it is still not being implemented the way it's supposed to be implemented by the very staff that's going to be left behind in driving the new system, I'm assuming, as well?
So for me, I think there are low-hanging fruits here that we can quickly deal with. I think we had a discussion with TDG and Jabu, the self-doc, that we will need to have a workshop firstly on the SOPs to see what can be done within the confines of the current legislation. So that is something that the department will work on, and we will workshop it until we find a solution, again, within the current legal confines. The other thing that we'll need to do is to engage with our legal colleagues, because there's an admission, not just from the community side, but from the state as well, that's in its current form, the Act 49, it's not the act that is regulating your situation correctly. So we will have to engage with them and check what can be done, or rather what can be, there's an English word I'm looking for, what can be suspended currently? What is possible to suspend in the legislation while we continue with the policy process? It's something that I cannot commit on now, but we'll need them to get advice from our legal colleagues if there is anything that can be done in that space just to alleviate the pain that is in there. The second issue that you are raising around the time it takes to finalize amendments, it's something that's really the department will need to work on. I don't think it's something. Now I was about to say if the minister can hear this, but now I remember that the Deputy Minister is here. So what I'm saying now, Minister has already heard, basically. But the Minister, I don't think he would be impressed to hear the stories that you are sharing here. Because the hindrance is not the law, the hindrance is not the policy, it's just having colleagues doing the right time, so right thing for our clients, basically. I think it's something that would need to be addressed. Unfortunately, I'm coming from the policy space. The good thing, again, I keep referring to Doc. Doc is directly on the call phase of implementing this. It's something that we just we can't delay this. It's like, I was speaking with a colleague there. I don't know whether you she or her or they.
They safer. They safer.
Is it Sia?
If you're not sure.
Sorry? They. What was being raised was, and you'll take it for granted if you're not in the situation, is that, look, I can't apply for my driver's license. It means I cannot drive. There are many things that you can manage. So we cannot be, because once that happens, your life stops. And that's the message I think that needs to go out clearly to our officials, that if you do not issue a proper document to this person, that person's life has just stopped.
Yeah. But in addition to that, right, so it's one thing to acknowledge the delay and that somebody is responsible for that delay and that there needs to be follow-up to be able to expedite the matter through the system, but the accountability question, how are officials being held accountable? And when we looked at the SOPs, there's about 26 different steps in terms of where a document goes from the point of application through processing and then again arriving at the service user. At each of those steps, there's a
health. And for us, a key issue is the requirement around medicalization. And that is not accessible in the public health sector. It is available, but it takes an inordinate amount of time. And in the private sector, it is unaffordable. I personally bankrupted myself during my PhD to be able to live as I live now. And that I'm lucky to have been able to do that. Is there a possibility of suspending that requirement? What are the steps and relationship like with the Department of Health in terms of in the new act, in the new ID Act, not having a requirement around medicalization so that people can get on and live their lives?
Two things. So in terms of what can be suspended, a colleague earlier on who's a lawyer was sitting on this chair.
Sanya.
Sanya. Is she? You still here? I think offline we'll need to have a discussion, and then we'll bring on our legal colleagues to have a discussion on what is possible, because we cannot just say here what can be suspended and give you false hope.
Sure.
So let's have that discussion with our legal colleagues and see if the medical report is one of the elements that can be suspended. And I think also when we're discussing during lunch, we propose regular engagement with the community. So we can even structure those engagements. So it's not engagement for the sake of engagement. We've got a clear program of action on what we need to deal with. Also from our department, fortunately, I see Reggie Ditela. I think most of you know Reggie. I think we can continue facilitating through Reggie so that we have a clear program of action around these issues.
Okay. And in terms of moving forward with the new, because in terms of the new ID Act and the relationship with the department, and whether that is something that is going to be carried over, is it a question around medicalization? Are we saying that we're not going to require that any longer?
Look, remember the requirement for the medical reports arises because of Act 49.
Mm-hmm.
So as we change Act 49, and obviously we'll be working with you,
mm-hmm.
we'll be able to identify things like even this report. What is the rationale behind it? We still require it.
Mm.
If people who need it, they can give. I think in this room we haven't found the reason why you should keep it.
Mm.
Even the Prof. Bernard, when he was speaking earlier on, was very clear that it will be, they don't want that, it's an extra burden on them.
On the health department.
So I don't see from where I'm, the policy point of dealing with identity, because remember we say my legal identity should not depend on my sex, my gender. That is not how I want to be identified, to be able to access services or to be able to travel or to transact. I just need a document that says I am a human being, I am a citizen, if there's also a need to say that on the document, or this is my age. Those are the things that in future, as the identity evolves, may even fall off. But at this stage, what we're saying, I don't see why you need a medical report. That is a personal view. But as we engage, I think we will be able to influence the process towards that direction.
That's great to hear. Thank you.
Do you want to open it up?
Should we open up to the
Yeah.
floor? So you've heard a lot from us, and we think we'll open it up to the floor for questions. Just a reminder that if you do have a question, can you raise your hand, and then we'll point you to the mics on the left or right. Does anyone have questions?
Theo.
See a hand at the back, and then John. And I can't see online.
Savuka.
Okay, let's go with at the back there, and then John.
So before questions come, I was warned. They say that be ready. They said good luck. So let's see how far my luck carries me.
We're in the afternoon already today, and your luck is running well.
True. Shame.
That's the introduction.
Exactly.
No, yeah, I'm quite dangerous. Okay, so I don't know if this is but the first one should be a question, but I think also most of my commentaries are going to relate with what the comrades had been uttering this entire time. The first question that I have for the House is, when is policymakers or policy making of Home Affairs ever going to be, or rather project the need to entail rigorous debate around identity, race, sexuality, gender identity, culture, and religion? Second one, this is a commentary. Taking into cognizance that trans people are not passive recipients of a predetermined concept of citizenship, because we are constantly contested and constructed by the actions and thoughts of individuals instead of communities. 3, we get that citizenship and democracy is the ethical goal, but the truth is that it's not an achieved reality. 4, I think because the system does not see trans people as real people, we end up struggling to navigate. And so this brings me to the comment that what happens to a very poor, illiterate child in Northwest Province who will never, ever be able to come in this space who will never ever have the selective privilege that I harness right now in real lifetime, who will never ever be with this people that holds such kind of power. What do I tell the little child in the rural space to say that your rights matters? Last question. How do we link the popular, the personal, and the political?
Thank you, Seo.
Thank you.
Should we take 2 more people and then answer all those questions to try and...
questions.
I think you and Seo must maybe have coffee and...
Yes, I think so.
But you can try to address it.
Question number 2, and then John, and then we'll answer some questions.
Okay.
Afternoon. I'm so tired. I'm sure my English won't run away. My question, I think Einstein earlier on raised it of saying, why don't we just opt to saying everybody at birth has a gender neutral ID? Because I am looking at, for me, who's now have a choice to have a gender neutral ID, and yes, we are saying we're going to campaign and say everybody could have it, but let's be realistic. How many countries in Africa are very LGBTQI friendly? And let me say I want to travel now, and it goes back to say our passport would be still say I am gender neutral, or would they have to be specific of saying this is a male or a female? Going into a country which doesn't recognize me and then say I'm coming in with this gender neutral ID, how safe would that make me if that is not a standard for South Africa? Then going back into saying if we also saying people can either choose at birth if they're going to have a gender neutral ID or say a binary ID, whose decision would be that? My parents or someone else? Because you're still taking away my right to choose my gender. You are still giving it to other people, whereby we are saying we are running away from that. We are saying we want to identify ourselves. If for someone who doesn't even know about these things, who doesn't come and have this white English that we are talking here in the ground, saying we have, I know this and I want to medically transition, and they don't even know where to go because there's no education going further forward. Looking at also changing the policy around changing of the ID document, and saying if we are saying we're going to a 9-binary ID for everybody, don't we need also those cis homophobic and transphobic people to also say we agree for this policy? Because we cannot just sit in this room and say we are for it, and then the truth is the minority would not ever take over the majority. So how then we're going to look at that? Because we also need this. We also need our recognition. Yeah, I think so.
Thank you.
Because you covered most of it.
John, do you want to ask?
Okay, good day everyone. Molweni, dumelang, sambonan, goeiemorgen, goeiedag. Thank you for my fellow sisters for raising such important questions and points. Thank you for the panel as well for the discussions. Perhaps I just want to revise some of the engagements and thoughts, maybe just to get some clarity. In terms of the new legislation, the gender neutral legislation, which is something that I'm looking forward to, because I myself am gender non-conforming, and I battle to go and get the standardized smart ID, because I know it won't reflect my gender. So I live without an ID at the moment. How would that be documented? We spoke about letters 0 to 4 being for female women, and 5 to 9 for males. So how will the gender neutral ID look as a distinct difference to the others? Secondly, speaking to the process, you said it will take a year maybe to get the green paper of sorts, and then another year, March 2023, which means from 2 years from now, we can look forward to further engagements. That's a long time, right? practically speaking, it's a very long time. And we need to speak to how we can, again, engage the SOPs or the mechanisms that exist now. You mentioned also gender sensitization, which I think is a very important tool to first say, okay, Home Affairs staff, this is what we're engaging now, this is who we're engaging, and you need to be sensitized, you need to be ready for when we are doing this gender neutral implementation policy. You understand the language, you understand the practices, you're fully aware. What steps can we take now to make sure that civil society is part of those sensitization trainings? Because we need to make sure that we incorporate them in the provinces, nationally, the districts, everywhere. So how can we work together to form a coalition to make sure those are ongoing? Thirdly, speaks to the question that you avoided there, Mr. Sihle, about the processes of accountability, right? Which I think is something very critical. I think in every government space, there is a need for an engagement in terms of if services are not delivered to the people, what can the people do, right? We have the Constitution that guides us of what the principles are, what the rights are. We have Batupele principles that are plastered on walls, right? But still you find services aren't delivered. Still you find people going home feeling like they are shortchanged, and they stay for years or months not getting healthcare that they need, not getting the affirmations and administration processes that they need. So maybe it speaks to a mechanism, maybe that I'm not aware of, that government needs to have to regulate either complaints or to hold people accountable, to say, okay, we understand that these services are delivered. People are able to come in and express that those services were not met, and these are the steps of accountability that we need to do. These are steps moving forward that we need to take in order to affirm that these people's rights are seen and heard, and that we affirm that this process is working. Is there something right now that we can say, okay, I haven't had my ID for 2 years, I can go and call this number, I can go send in a letter to someone? If there is, please publicize it or give it to us now. Or how can we work better to make sure that in future there is a process to make sure people are accountable? Thanks.
Accountability, we're coming back.
Okay. Okay. Maybe.
That is Savuka.
Vukan?
Savuka.
Savuga, yes, Savuga. So, I'm not looking for a job, but I'm going to say what I'm going to say now. Yeah. One of my responsibilities in the department includes dealing with monitoring and evaluation, and also to deal with the strategic planning in the department. So the immediate thing that I'm going to recommend, and this has got to do with amendments, because that's there where there seems to be a big issue that is being raised here. We are going to elevate issues around, this is what I'm going to recommend to the team, that we elevate issues around amendments to, maybe as a start, we've got what you call an annual performance plan that gets tabled in Parliament. Then we've got what we call an AOP, annual operational plan, that gets approved at a departmental level. So what we'll need to do is to make sure that amendments, they're not hiding somewhere else but are part of the plan. So that when we then come for quarterly review meetings, there's a clear report on what's happening with amendments. So I think that in terms of accountability from my section, that is what we are able to do. But I still go back, I was not, Safuga, I was not avoiding the question of accountability, but I'm saying managers must manage. Every manager, and our Director General says, if you are a director in the department, you are earning $1 million a year. So you must justify your getting $1 million a year. So as far as that one is concerned, managers must manage. But in my area, what I think I'm able to recommend is issues around amendments. And amendments, it's not just this community, but generally, there's an outcry around amendments, whether it's the surname or you were married and now you want to change the surname back to your initial surname. So issues of amendment, I think if there's one big issue, which is operational and not policy that has come out here, it's about amendments. And I think, Doc, we can do that. He's agreeing with me.
Excellent. And on the 1 million, there's a lot of trans and gender diverse and intersex persons that can work for 1 million in the department.
Actually, it's just that there are things that you don't know. I think as we engage, we must find a way. I was speaking with colleagues who are dealing with the issues, what do you call the equity? That when you're dealing with issues of equity in terms of employment, you need to build in the process to accommodate other groups. Because now what we're chasing in terms of equity is it's females. When you're talking gender in government, you're talking male and female. So, and I'm responding to the question that you're raising, that there are many transgender persons who want to come and work in that space. And it's true. The sooner we change the policy around equity, you then become specific that the person that we're looking for in this position is a person from this community in terms of equity. I think it will then solve quite a lot of issues around them. So,
and just on a practical note there, I think we recently had an engagement with one university in South Africa that's currently trying to strengthen their own processes of accountability to the community, and this very matter came up around, so how do we account to the Department of Labor, for example, when the employment equity standards and frameworks only speak to binary genders and not necessarily to non-binary genders, because now when we report, it almost seems as if, and our staff members are not sensitized and aware of it, we can easily undermine the community in not appointing the necessary persons to fill particular positions for employment equity at an institutional level, but then being able to, of course, transform law and policy to ensure that across the board in the country, that there is an onus placed on institutions, on business, etc., to have to then account on that, to that standard.
You know, I think these engagements, if they can only be limited to Home Affairs, we would have lost the battle.
Yeah.
I think the biggest challenge that we sit with is to deal with the binary system as a whole. Because you can change we can change the ID, but if the binary system of the state has not changed, it still has got some limitation. Like right now, I'm speaking about the equity policy. It's very binary. You can't be coming with a different ID or gender neutral ID, but the system is still designed that way. So there are many changes beyond what we're doing today that still have to happen.
Yeah,
definitely.
We only have a few minutes left, so if we can pick some of the questions that we still need to.
So the first three questions, we'll deal with them offline. We've exchanged numbers, so we will deal with those one offline. In terms of the child at birth, I think we have said here the recommendation clearly from this meeting is when the policy comes into operation, we need gender neutral ID numbers for children. So it takes away that concern that we have whether the parent chooses the ID or not. We're saying in future when a child is born with a gender neutral ID number. There's a lot of advocacy that we need to do in the space. Yeah. It's unnecessary, but as you were saying, we have homophobic people amongst ourselves. We have people who do not understand that if I'm different from you, it doesn't mean I'm a less of a person than you are. So obviously we need to deal with that.
Maybe, can I interrupt and say that for point of clarity, what you're saying is that all children will receive gender-neutral ID numbers, but that doesn't mean that child is not going to be registered as MF on your back system, but the gender-neutral ID number without an M and F on an ID card at 10 years old will allow that child more time for development, and we're not impressing on homophobes or transphobes or parents in general that they should raise their children in any other way. We're just saying the documentation should begin implementation that would allow for a sense of ease through life until a point can be made, a decision can be made on the child, for the child themselves. Okay.
All right, I think those were the...
I think that was it.
Were the main issues, basically.
We have come to the end of our time as well, unless you have anything else you want to add.
I just think that there were a number. There's one question over there or comment. Can we just take that as the last question?
Sure.
There are no more answers.
Thank you. I just want to make some few comments around the discussion there. One, and I guess Sihle mentioned it earlier, the issue around putting an X somewhere presupposes something. Once you see M, it's not marked, F is not marked, and in the third box there is an X, suggests something. We don't need that, and I don't think that is what you need. The nature of identity and identification is not only limited to the South African law. It includes other laws of other countries. If you look at CRVS in particular, we would need to know how many of these people are in this country are males, females, you name it, and all those kind of things. And it means we must begin to effect these changes gradually. But let me come back home to the procedure to submit applications. And this is what hits us hard most. And I'm standing here fully aware that we are not providing you with the service you urgently need. That is one point. That is why he said managers should manage. But as and when we receive these applications, there are certain prerequisites or preconditions that must be met prior making a submission. And these are the very same preconditions that this House says we do not need. So if at all, those preconditions under the existing law have been or shall have been met, surely we should be in a position to quickly process those applications. Unfortunately, because it requires, amongst others, your fingerprints, you cannot send that document electronically. There is one system called HANIS. Once we receive the original record of an application, we have to remove or lift the fingerprints from the initial ID that was allocated, replace that with the most recent or the most recently allocated ID. You raised a question, and this is what you said. Can we suspend the current requirements such as medication? As a practitioner of the existing law, and don't take me somehow, my response is no. honestly, we are audited in the work that we do. At the end of the year, the auditor says, your law says for you to be able to process this application, you need to follow step 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if you miss a particular step, you must then explain why did you effect these changes, yet you did not comply with the required pieces of legislation or the required practices. That then becomes a problem. I am not in a state to practice what I feel and what I consider is legitimate. You know, when you go to a gantry and somebody says, I was told nobody should enter after 6. That's it. You would not be accepted on the other side, even if a lion chases you. That is the nature of how bureaucratic systems work. You've got to follow the rules of the game. I will not process any application that does not meet certain requirements. Let's fight here, and let's find a better way through policy. I guess there was a reason behind why someone from health said these things are not necessary, right? But I guess somewhere health was involved. To come now right here and say, I don't understand why these people should be subjected here, right? Look, I'm not a physician, I'm not a medical practitioner. But I guess if Aaron goes today at Home Affairs, I'm deciding this. On what basis? These are the questions that are going to be asked. On what basis do you then consider wanting us to effect the changes? I think there was a reason behind the requirements, but are these requirements still necessary at this point, at this day and age? Do we still need these kind of things? You mentioned accountability, for which every director at Home Affairs earns over $1 million. I worked in this directorate for 7 years, from 2013 up until March 2021. So if you had made any submission of your application between those dates and that was not dealt with, blame it on me. And I am prepared to, through Masela Longwepe, effect the necessary changes, because my colleague it's now responsible for the everyday applications and all sorts. The commitment I make in this house is that I'm giving my number and her number so that we can begin to deal with. There must be some form of changes in a month. Even if you have 30 and we resolve 5, that will be the most happiest. As long as there is a process going and we are able to effect the necessary changes. Her number is 072.
You must comply with POPI Act.
Yeah, she consented. Yeah. 072 613 0022. Masela Longwepe. She deals with these kind of things on a daily basis. When she wakes up at home, going to work, mine is 076 803 8720. We are serving the states, and we are entrusted with these responsibilities to serve above self. And that is the commitment we are making. Thank you.
Sorry that you've been thrown under the bus, Maselaelo. The queries will be coming now, en masse.
We're done. Thank you everyone for all your questions and for engaging with us, and thank you.
Thank you so much for having this conversation. after you've not been scheduled for this conversation after lunch. I think you shed some light on a number of other issues that we still had not a lot of clarity on, and we look forward to journeying with you as the department in really strengthening the legal framework on legal gender recognition.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to that panel. I think what we got from that is a robust discussion on what works and what doesn't work. But we also got some phone numbers to hold people accountable. So that's really, really important. And we also got insights into some of the difficulties of the bureaucratic process and why it's sometimes difficult to change things at the speed that we would like them to be changed. And also I think what we do need to reflect on, and I also speak on behalf of government as a whole here, is why it would take 2 years or more to change legislation. I think that is something that we can improve on. And when we say we're building a capable and ethical state, I think those are some of the things that we must speak to. So we're now moving into the next and the last segment for the day. And I think you guys have been a wonderful audience, great questions, very engaging. I would require you to continue that in the next session as we hold out towards the end. And I would like to introduce Advocate Nono Murogani, a lawyer with an interest in human rights, and he will also, or rather, they will also continue the conversation on legal reforms. Some of the panel members from that panel include Mauro Caparán, the director at Gate International from Argentina, and Zan Chiam, deputy director on Transgender Europe at TGEU. So the next session is a virtual session. You would have seen on your program, there they are, great. On your program, Liberty Matesa is meant to be one of the panelists, but that's no longer the case. So Grayson Taylor replaces Liberty Matesa. Over to you, Dhlomo, and welcome. Switch your video on, please, then unmute yourselves. Is Dhlomo there? Can you hear us? Do we have him online? Oh, there we go. Excellent.
To tell me that it's okay for me to speak, or and if you can hear me on the other side.
You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone, my name is Riina. My pronouns are they and them. I'm a lawyer who is stationed in South Africa, who's really interested in particularly intersex and trans rights, and more broadly, like human rights in general. And today we'll be talking about, the process of reform. But as I was sitting here, I was saying, the previous panel discussion really went to the meat and the heart of the matter. I'm kind of sitting back and I'm like, I don't know what we will be discussing. But what I will do is I will start with Mario. Instead of reading people's bios, I think I will give them the opportunity just to say 1 or 2 sentences about who they are and how they come to this panel before we continue with the panel. So over to you, Mario.
Hi everyone, it's fine. My name is Mauro Cabral Greenspan. I am a trans and intersex activist from Argentina. I am also the executive director of GATE, and I had been invited to this panel to discuss on legal reform. Can you hear me well? Okay, and I'm currently based in Buenos Aires.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And then over to you, Grayson. Just a short introduction.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Grayson Vanguard Taylor. I'm the legal and policy coordinator at Gender Dynamics, and I'm quite excited to be here this afternoon unpacking such important issues, speak to agency and self-determination. So I'm quite excited. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I don't want to mispronounce your name because I want to pronounce it, but I'm very afraid that I will like botch it. So I'll ask you to give me the permission to say your name so that I know how to say it properly, just to honor you.
I'll start and you follow. Nice to meet everyone. Hi, my name is Zan Shyam. I'm originally from Singapore. I'm the incoming Deputy Director at Transgender Europe, or TGEU, and very happy to be here and see some familiar faces and new faces too.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think this is going to be a really exciting conversation. But I wanted to start the conversation by, trying to get some reflections from all three of you. I mean, we normally speak about legal gender recognition, right? And we as activists and people in this space sort of throw this word around, LGR, LGR, LGR. But let's say I'm just an ordinary citizen and I'm really interested in this type of work and I'm attending this conference, and at this conference they're like LGR, LGR, and I really don't know what it is. So I'd like each of you to speak about, from the spaces that you come from, what do you understand and what do you mean when you speak about legal gender recognition? Mara, I'll start with you and then Grayson and then Zan. So I'll go that way.
Well, it's actually very simple. Thank you very much for that question. So everyone has an identity, a personal identity, the person that we are, and that person, has a name and also has a gender, and we identify like in different ways. And when we talk about legal gender recognition, what we said is actually we want our personal identity to be recognized by the law. We want to be a person before the law. It's just that. But in most places of the world, people are assigned legally an identity by a doctor when they are born. So the person, no one has the chance of saying, hey, this is me. It was decided by someone else. In many cases, that decision, is fine for the person. They say, the doctor made this decision and it works for me. In many other cases, the decision doesn't work. And what trans people want is to have their personal identity recognized by the law. That's legal gender recognition in a nutshell.
Absolutely. Just to add on to what Morris said, I think for a very long time, since the start of existence, we've always had other people speaking on behalf of trans people. Other people always assuming that these are what trans and gender diverse persons need. But the fact of the matter is that what we need and what people are putting on the table is completely different. And when we talk about law reform, we talk about law reform that speaks to our identity, speaks to our agency, speaks to self-determination and the right for freedom of movement, wherever it may be. And that's really the bone of contention today, is that the current laws that are at stake, or that we're currently using.
Kristen, I feel like you're rushing ahead. I think we'll go to that. For right now, just for us to have something to speak about, firstly what we understand when we talk about legal gender recognition. And I think an important bit of what you've said really is the fact that the way that legal gender recognition has been understood has been outside of us as trans and gender diverse persons, right? Like, we've sort of been imposed what we are supposed to meet in order to get some form of legal gender recognition, especially in a country such as South Africa. I don't know if you want to add a little bit more and then we'll move on.
No, absolutely. I think you took the words right out of my mouth there, Tlohi. But you're quite right. Legal gender recognition in a nutshell is having the ability to choose. And quite often I say that the difference between equality and equity is, for example, a gender inclusive bathroom. Equality is having a male and female bathroom, but equity is bridging the gap, of those that have been marginalized for such a long time. And that would be having a gender inclusive bathroom. So in a nutshell, it's agency and having the right to self-determine.
I didn't want to get in here, but I think it's really interesting, and I love the word that you use, gender inclusive, right? I think that there should be a move to speak, we often speak about gender neutral, right? As sort of like this thing that, like, for me sometimes sits quite painfully, because I'm like, it's not gender neutral, it's supposed to be gender inclusive, because it's saying that there are these vast numbers of genders that exist. And we are now being inclusive by saying all of you, no matter how you are and who you say you are to be, you are included. So it's not neutral, it's inclusive, right? Which again gets to the equality versus equity part. Zara, I just want to come to you and speak about, in your context, what does legal gender recognition really mean?
Yes, so maybe I'll highlight the legal side, right? It's not something that is an arbitrary decision for states or families or communities to necessarily impose on people. There are legal standards that have been decided about what is best practice in terms of legal gender recognition. So, the European Court of Human Rights has determined in many cases that it should be available in using a self-determination model. The United Nations, as you've heard earlier today, has also said quite clearly that there are very firm human rights-based standards that need to be applied. So I think when we talk about legal gender recognition, we should also be very clear that there are standards that already exist, and we don't have to invent new ones. And it's up to the states to just, try as much as possible to implement these.
I really love this, and I think we'll spend a lot of time a little bit later on in the panel discussion just to delve deeper into what these international standards are. But I wanted to come and think about the context in which you operate in, right? And think particularly about when you think about the law that regulates sort of this legal gender recognition, what are sort of the opportunities, right? So I'm thinking necessarily like maybe before the Alteration of Sex Description Act came into force in South Africa, there were no place for people to change their gender marker. So the opportunity in many instances is that the alteration, in as much as it may have problems and it may have issues, allows people to sort of begin to change their gender marker. So that's sort of the opportunity. So in your various contexts, what do you think like the laws that regulate gender recognition have provided? What opportunities have they brought forward? Grayson, just I'll start with you, and then anyone can pick it up so that it doesn't look like I'm always looking on Maro, who is on just next to me on the screen.
Absolutely. I think today we've spoken quite extensively about Act 49 of 2003, which allows trans and gender diverse persons to change their gender marker, to change their names as well. Unfortunately, Act 49 is a short-term solution, a long-term problem, because unfortunately it does have its shortfalls. It does pathologize. There are no guidelines, there are no turnaround periods. And in the meantime, as trans and gender diverse persons, our lives still need to continue. We still need to apply for jobs, we still need to apply for schooling. So that's where, when we say short-term solution, long-term problem really comes in, is that it's sort of okay, but it's not good enough. We've discussed extensively today in terms of where the problem lies. And I think what Act 49 really provides us is a platform to really pick out the problematic areas and those that have been excluded within the Act. I mean, when we speak about exclusion, we're talking about refugees and asylum seekers. We're talking about the rights of children, where children for a very long time, their agency has been shut down and invisibilized, where legal guardians and parents have become gatekeepers of agency. So what, in essence, Act 49 really provides us is a platform to look at other opportunities where, okay, they've missed the plot over here. What do we do next? So it's good. We've got the ability to change our gender marker. We've got the ability to change our name. And mind you, we're the first in Africa to actually have a law of this nature. But however, it's currently not enough. It needs to be accompanied by adequate standard operating procedures that speak to the experiences of people in South Africa, that speak to refugees, speak to leave there for now.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Anyone want to jump on and speak about what opportunities legal gender recognition does in the context that you operate?
I can jump in quickly. So I think, for a lot of European countries, it actually, they have had really exciting advances and setbacks as well, but I'll talk about the advances. So the opportunity to look at non-binary options, to get away with the forced divorce requirement that existed for a long time, different levels of diagnosis, so sterilization, of course, to get rid of that, but also different medical diagnoses, age requirements, and also, as Grayson mentioned, the opportunity to give people who are non-citizens in your jurisdiction the ability to change whatever documents that they might be holding so that they can operate in the society as, at the level that a citizen could, ideally. So there's been certainly those opportunities, but the progress hasn't been consistent across Europe and Central Asia. And there have been lots of setbacks as well in the last couple of years that we can unpack slowly throughout the session.
Yes, thank you so much. I love the comment about forced divorce. We had a matter in South Africa, KOS versus the Minister of Home Affairs, which effectively wanted to do a forced divorce type situation. You had these two people who were in a cisgender relationship, and throughout the sustenance of their marriages, two of them transitioned, and now they wanted to change their, their markers on the birth and registration, but they were obviously married. And South Africa has these various ways in which a person can get married, such as the Marriage Act, which says one man and one woman. And then we've got the Civil Unions Act, which allows everyone to get married. And, the argument from the Home Affairs side was effectively these people had to divorce and then remarry. But the court really was like, no, it's not necessary. So it's interesting to think about in some advances where we think we're not that progressive, that we've made some progressive moves, that the court was willing to say that what does marriage have to do with people wanting to self-determine what gender they can be? Mara, I want to come to you and speak about some of the opportunities that exist in your context.
Thank you. Well, Argentina actually passed the first gender identity law in the country in 2012. And actually, it was the first time that the gender identity law in the world was fully compatible with the human rights standards set by the Yogyakarta Principles in 2006. So the gender identity law in Argentina allows people to change gender markers. Now it offers 3 options, including the X for non-binary people. But to change gender markers based on self-determination through a very simple administrative procedures, it allowed migrants to apply. It allowed children to apply, but it also has a component that is not common in other gender identity laws, which is that it also includes access to gender affirming procedures, considering that identity is not only internal, but it's also related with, people's bodies. So Article 11 on personal development include access to gender affirming healthcare under full coverage on private and public healthcare systems. So this law has been used by more of 10,000 people in the country since 2012, and it also allowed other progressive laws. So, for example, Argentina approved its law on abortion this year, and it included women, but also all people able to get pregnant in the coverage for the law, showing that something that is really important, and maybe this is another question, but I just want to say that being a law based on self-determination that allowed people just to change, to be ourselves, and in terms of identity, but in terms of embodiment on the base of self-determination, the law is not putting any other legal regulation at stake or at risk. It actually expanding the rights for everyone in the country, not diminishing any kind of legal protection.
I mean, I love that. I think we should just end the panel discussion and say that really is the thing, right? A lot of people who are against these types of legal gender recognition, reform, or sort of things are always talking about but the society, and we're changing, and you're like, no, you're actually just making it better for everyone to live, right? And for everyone to live as best as themselves. But I also wanted to speak to you know, a lot of what you've been saying has been like, the laws have really allowed people to come. I think Argentina has really even expanded other laws. You think about the abortion laws that not only speaks to women, but speaks to people to get pregnant, which is a result of that legal gender recognition link. But I think within the opportunities, there are also gaps that are in place, right? So you think particularly like Argentina may have a self-determination model, which is in line with the Yucata principles and what the Victor was talking about this morning, right? But you also then see that there may be some form of other gaps, right? I think in the context that we come from, in the South African context particularly, there is a lot of like medical pathologizing that takes place, right? There's a lot of like gatekeeping, right? It's one, you think about the pathologizing, but also you think about the financial assistance and the financial access that goes in there. I don't know in the last sort of like maybe 2 months, how many Go Starter events or Go Back a Buddy or crowdfunding events that I've seen on my timeline personally of people wanting to get money for top surgery because of how expensive it is, and how in many instances you will wait a long time if you are to go to a public hospital in the country. So I want to speak in the various contexts, right? And I'll start with you, Mauro, just about, although there are these opportunities, right? What are the gaps that are in place? What are some of the problems that comes with you know, legal gender recognition? And you may say to me, you know, in Argentina, because we've got self-determination and everything, we really don't have any gaps. But I'm interested to what are some of the gaps that you've seen in the implementation of these legislations?
No, and I would never say that, because there's no such a thing as a perfect law, and socioeconomic issues are key issues affecting trans and gender diverse people everywhere, and especially living in global South countries. So in that sense, my country can propose great laws, but the implementation, especially when it requires money, well, that's a different story. Argentina has passed different pieces of laws and policies focused on trans people's access to public employment, creating quotas for trans employment. But of course, many things need to be changed because of the structural exclusion that trans people face at the level of education and in the job market. So all of those things are part of the problem, and that's why it's so important to understand that access to legal gender recognition is extremely important, and at the same time is like the ground zero for trans people's human rights. And I understand what you say in terms of pathologization, and I do understand that starting to treat certain people like human beings when historically we have been treated differently is difficult, or is challenging for some people to believe that we are their equals. But that's why the pathologization mean is to stop having a psychomedical authority saying this person is a full human being and this person is less of a human being, and then we need to manage, you know, their access to rights. However, we have to remember that the World Health Organization, especially the World Health Assembly, decided on the matter of trans pathologization in 2019, removing all the categories that classify trans people as having a psychological or psychiatric or medical disorder. So this is the point when we are at the point of psychomedical depathologization. Well, it's time to move to legal depathologization, but also to social depathologization. And for those people who are not trans, to accept that we are equals and that human rights are universal, and then the right to identity applied to us all. So everything is on the table. What is missing right now is equality. At the end, depathologization means that, you know, to be equal before the law. But that requires, as you said, socioeconomic justice, and we need to move in that direction for sure.
I mean, Mauro, you've said such really wonderful and gripping words, right? To think about depathologizing as not only a pathology medical issue or a legal issue, but to think about like how we move in spaces, right? I had written the first sort of public opinion on trans peoples in South Africa, which was undertaken by the Institute and at the University of California. And it also to see that like the fabric And one of the real problems is that we can have perfect laws, as you've said, but when we don't have some form of education and some form of depathologizing of people in society, we're going to continuously have these problems, right? And the depathologizing for me means that there are civil servants who are supposed to help us change our gender markers, change our identity documents, who live in the society, who help us educating those particular people. The laws are just going to be these laws that look beautiful on paper, but not implemented. Grace, I'm going to leave you for last because, you know, I might want to make it a little bit difficult for you about what's happening in South Africa. So I'll come to you and think about the European context, right? And think about, like, in as much as the European Court of Human Rights have given these amazing sort of judgments and these amazing international standards and best practices, there must be some form of gaps that we're seeing. And what are those gaps that we're seeing, that even though we have these laws that are supposed to be amazing in terms of gender recognition and in line with international human rights standards and the UCARTA principles, what are some of the gaps that exist in a global North situation? Because, you know, we sort of always look to the North and think, if the North can get it right, then surely the South must be able to get it right. But what is the North doing? Or,
you know, what the law gives you, right? So there's definitely gaps like that. And I would also say, while we're talking about legality, that let's also talk about the lack of legality. So in a lot of places, and also including Europe, Central Asia, there are no legal gender recognition processes, which means there's an absence of it. And sometimes there's that strange in-between zone of administrative processes. And administrative processes are difficult because they're interpreted much more liberally, depending on the officer, you know, at the counter, for example, who might decide that the interpretation of a policy, you know, is up to them to decide. So, you know, at the end of the day, laws are definitely the first step, but after that, it's actually being able to spread it out across the different agencies, across the different ministries in the country, and to work together with trans organizations in that country to actually bring everything together, right? To give people the rights that the law actually intends to give.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And Grace, I want to come to you and think about the South African context, right? I mean, a number of trans and gender diverse activists have for years said, okay, Act 49, thank you, but it's time for you to go, right? But what are some of the reasons? What are the gaps that exist in Act 49? As you've said earlier on in your presentation, you spoke about the idea of it's a short-term solution with long-term problems. So speak to us a little bit about these long-term problems and these gaps that Act 49 has created in the South African context.
Absolutely. As said, it's a short-term solution to a long-term problem. Yes, we've had some victories, you know, in the application of the law. But however, it doesn't cut across everyone. And what the sad reality is that Act 49, the birth and death registration, as well as the Identification Act, all speak to one another. And one of the problems that these three highlight is the fact that they speak to a very binary model of identification. The expectation of providing medical proof, you know, and also speaking to intersex individuals that, you know, you need to live as a particular gender for 2 years before, you know, you can affirm who you are. And simply does not work because, you know, there isn't a particular benchmark as what a trans and gender diverse person should look like. And some of the challenges that Act 49 produces is the fact that you have trans and gender diverse persons who don't want to undergo gender affirming healthcare, but however want to change their gender markers. You do have trans and gender diverse persons who want to change their gender markers and as well as undergo gender affirming healthcare. However, you'll also find that you might not necessarily have an individual that wants to be recognized within the binary, but outside of the binary. So it's quite important to produce that third option for people to really self-identify. And this is where it all went wrong. You know, when a baby got born, you know, the sex assigned at birth was quite binary. And that's where it all went wrong because the implementation in society then got dismally misconstrued, where you can't self-identify. There are no other options to self-identify. And I mean, you've touched on, yes, there are major issues in terms of the Identification Act, the Birth and Death Registry, as well as Act 49. But I mean, we've had, you know, immense progress in terms of the Jade September case, where you've got a trans-identifying woman who's been sent to a male prison who can now self-identify. And the court actually said, listen, you are who you say you are, and no one can say otherwise. And that's a victory. And those particular standards and benchmarks can be used across every single department in South Africa, within civil society, within society in general. And I think what also is missing, the bigger picture that's missing, particularly in South Africa, is that there isn't a congruency between,
I think Grayston may be frozen. Can all my other guests hear me in the meantime? Or am I?
Okay, there we go. Nitlo, I think it's you. Maybe just log off and try reconnect again. Maybe I should note questions in the meantime from this side, since we are running towards the end. Yeah, given the discussion thus far, perhaps do we have questions in the room? Come on. I know it's the graveyard one, but we're almost there. Literally.
I suppose I'll just wait for the questions to be sent to me if there are any questions in the room. But one thing that I wanted to ask is a lot of the discussion has been centered around like this sort of understanding of self-determination. For someone who's sitting at home, who's watching, who's listening for the first time, what do we really mean when we talk about self-determination? I mean, Zahan and Maro both spoke about, like in Europe, like the models and the benchmark has been sort of self-determination. But what does that really mean, right? When we talk about self-determination, for someone who may not understand, what do we mean to say we want legal gender recognition laws to allow people to self-determine?
Just to say, I don't think you need to filter the questions. I think we can hear you and you can hear us. If someone wants to ask a question in the room, we'll just ask them to go to the mic and then inform you that maybe there are 5 people who would like to ask questions, then you can note the questions and get the panel to respond.
So keep it simple.
I love that. I feel like we should like frame it. I love that. Like I really needed to just, I would like it. So if you can pop it on the chat for us to have, I think it's really fantastic just to keep it somewhere and be like, that's the whole point. Are there any questions from the floor?
Yes.
May I add something very, very briefly about self-determination? I think that one very simple way of understanding it is to think of the opposite of self-determination. So if you don't believe in if you don't have self-determination, it means that other person decide who you are. To have self-determination is to be able to decide yourself. So when we think in terms of laws or policies that are not based on self-determination, it means to have a third person or a psychologist or a doctor or a priest or a politician telling you who you are. So self-determination is just basically that, the right to say who you are by yourself without an external.
We have 2 questions on the floor.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions from the floor?
Yes, we have 2 questions on the floor, Dr. B and
sort of against self-determination. So I will allow any one of you to go.
Sorry, Letho.
There's
There's another question on the floor before we continue.
Was pointed to you, so you can go first.
Hey, I'm really surprised, by people being really afraid of other people's self-determination. Like, what is this madness that is going to happen? And as you said, Argentina is doing fine, and there's not madness at schools or hospitals because, there is an underlying phobia there that has to do with identifying trans people with criminals. and that believe that if we enter certain spaces, that we're going to commit all sort of crimes. And I have to say that this is based on very anti-migrant and racist rhetorics in society. When you hear the way in which certain anti-gender movements, even in my country, speak about trans people, and you see the way in which they talk about migrants coming from somewhere, they say, you know, they don't look like us, they speak there. Sorry for speaking too much.
You summed it up so beautifully. Before we hand over to the people there, is there any last words from the two other panelists in relation to the questions that have been asked?
I'll jump in really quickly. So I was anticipating this question, and I think it is, I wouldn't say it's a fair question, but I would say it's an obvious question that we all need to work to addressing. And in the European context, for example, there has been a bit of work done, but not enough work done on countering this. So in the, I think a couple of years ago, in the 7 countries that had a self-determination model, when the European Council was looking at statistics that were that they were using to count trans people, there was no evidence at all that women, for example, were being disadvantaged or prejudiced against through the collection of statistics on trans people using a self-determination model. So that's positive, but TGU is pushing the European institutions to do better and to put more effort into analyzing, you know, these connections, so that there is more defense against these kinds of, let's say, obvious questions against self-determination models.
There is one more question on the podium. Sorry to hijack the platform.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
My apologies. Sorry, there is one last question. Just speaking to the various approaches that the countries are utilizing to affirm legal gender recognition, I'm just wondering what type of suggestions in terms of strategy and support can you put forward for our neighboring countries? So in terms of
the commonality is that they are post-Soviet countries and share common languages and cultures, but at the same time, there's very oppositional governments that exist there, and so a lot of that work is also about supporting them to connect and supporting them to build the alliances across each other and the resources to actually do the work. So a lot of it is for sure resourcing and actually supporting the organizations that are doing the work on the ground. And not necessarily thinking that it's the governments that are doing all of this work.
Grayston and Mara, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I think I spoke enough. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that the bone of contention really for the next 2 days is that one's identity matters. And you belong as much as any other person wherever you're situated. And we need to make sure that if there are laws that don't speak to that specific mandate, then therefore they should be repealed. And perhaps, have a draft legislation that really speaks to one's identity. And just to allow for one to really self-determinate. I think, that's my take home for today, that, you are who you say you are. No one can tell you otherwise. And we'll definitely keep on advocating. We'll definitely keep on doing what we're doing as civil society to make sure that the Department of Home Affairs, the Department of Justice really heeds into our thoughts and lived experiences that, listen, there's major changes that needs to be done. Act 49 needs major changes. Currently we've got Department of Home Affairs providing us with an opportunity where we'll have a third option for one to affirm yourself as who you are, and that these are the little successes that we look forward to, and we just hope that the implementation thereof will speak to our identities and not necessarily become another short-term solution to another long-term problem. I think I'll stop it there for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to our wonderful esteemed panelists. I think it's been a really wonderful opportunity to get different contexts, right, both from Argentina, Europe, and Central Asia, and also South Africa, to really begin to grapple about the legal reforms that we deal with when we think about legal gender recognition. But in essence, I think all of us are saying that self-determination is the model to go. Self-determination will ensure that our human rights as trans and gender diverse people are taken seriously. And thank you to the EU-SA Policy Dialogue for allowing us this opportunity and this space to have these conversations. And now we're going over back to you. And thank you everyone for what has been a fantastic discussion.
Indeed, I couldn't agree more with Nono. Thank you very much for facilitating the panel in the manner that we did. We really were able to get a broad perspective of insights from the global north and Argentina as well. So before I release you, because that's where we are, I just have a couple of administrative announcements that I would like to make. First is that at 5:30, there will be a debriefing session for the CSOs. It'll be right here in this room. And other than that, I wish to thank you very much for coming today. Please do come tomorrow. Tomorrow we start at 8:30, right on 8:30.